For 4 years, she'd worked in the back room of that gunsmith shop, her name never once on a business card. That afternoon, a collector walked in cradling a rifle worth more than her house. And when the apprentice told him the actual gunsmith was a 71-year-old woman in the back, he laughed and said he hadn't driven 3 hours for a grandmother to fumble around inside it. She said nothing. She held out her hand for the rifle. 40 minutes later, she set it back down, fully restored, a mechanism no other smith in the state had fixed in 11 years. But what she'd found hidden inside that rifle stock while she worked was about to matter far more than the repair ever did. Marisol Adair had worked in the back room of Hargrove & Sons Gunsmithing for 4 years, and in that time exactly 0 customers had asked to meet her. The shop's front room did all the talking: glass cases, wall racks, a bell over the door, and Ronnie Hargrove's 23-year-old grandson Colton behind the counter, who'd inherited the family name, but none of the family's actual gunsmithing knowledge, which was precisely why the real work happened behind a closed door in a back room that smelled of solvent and machine oil, where a silver-haired woman in reading glasses sat at a bench cluttered with tools most customers couldn't have named. She liked it that way. For years ago, when she'd answered Ronnie Hargrove's help-wanted ad after his own hands had gotten too arthritic for precision work, she'd made exactly one request. No name on the door, no photo on the wall, no introductions to customers who didn't need to know who was actually fixing their rifles. Ronnie, dying slowly of a cancer he never discussed, had asked no questions and gotten none in return, and when he passed 18 months later, Colton had simply kept the arrangement going because it was easier than understanding it. That Thursday afternoon, the bell over the front door chimed at 2:30, and a man in an expensive quilted vest walked in cradling a rifle wrapped in a soft velvet cloth, like it might wake up if jostled. "I need this looked at," the man said, setting the bundle carefully on the counter and unwrapping it with the reverence of someone handling a religious relic. Winchester Model 1873, family piece, for generations. The action seized has been for almost a decade. I've had it looked at by 3 different smiths, and nobody's been able to free it without risking damage to the receiver. Colton peered at the rifle with the specific, uncertain expression of a young man trying to look more knowledgeable than he was. "I can take a look, get it in the Q-dash. I need it done today," the man said. "I'm Reginald Ashcombe. I drove 3 hours because someone told me Hargrove's had the best gunsmith in the state for antique restoration work, and I don't have 3 more hours to waste finding out that was wrong." "Our gunsmith's in the back," Colton said. "She can probably dash." "She?" Ashcombe repeated, something shifting in his face, faint disbelief edging into something closer to open skepticism. "You're telling me the person who's going to put hands on a 150-year-old family heirloom is a woman working in your back room?" "She's very good," Colton said, a little defensively. Ashcombe laughed, not cruelly, exactly, but with the particular careless dismissal of a man who'd never once had to consider that his assumptions might be wrong. "Son, I didn't drive 3 hours for some grandmother to fumble around inside a mechanism worth more than her house. I need someone who actually understands period firearms. Do you have anyone like that, or is this it?" The backroom door opened before Colton could answer. Marisol Adair stood in the doorway, reading glasses pushed up into silver hair, a faint smell of gun oil clinging to her flannel shirt, having heard every word through a door that wasn't nearly as soundproof as Colton believed it was. "I'm the gunsmith," she said simply. Ashcombe looked her up and down with an expression that made no effort to hide its skepticism. "You're 70, easily." 71, Marisol said. "You said 3 smiths have already failed on this action." "That's right. May I see it?" Ashcombe hesitated, a long, visible hesitation, the calculation of a man deciding whether handing over an heirloom to a stranger he'd already insulted was wise. But something about her steady, patient waiting made refusing feel more awkward than agreeing. He slid the rifle across the counter. Marisol picked it up, turned it once in her hands, working the seized bolt with a gentle, testing pressure that told her everything about the nature of the jam within about 4 seconds. "Corrosion behind the locking lugs," she said. "Whoever attempted this before you didn't disassemble far enough to actually reach it. They were treating a symptom on the surface and leaving the real problem untouched." "That's what the second smith said too," Ashcombe admitted, some of the edge leaving his voice. He said, reaching at wrist, cracking the receiver. It does, if you don't know exactly where the stress points sit on a receiver this old. Marisol turned toward the back room. Give me 40 minutes. 40 minutes, Ashcombe repeated, incredulous. 3 smiths spent weeks on this. 3 smiths were guessing, Marisol said, and disappeared back through the door before he could argue further. She worked in silence, the way she always did, laying the rifle across a padded bench and beginning the careful disassembly, stock, fore-end, action, each piece set aside in the exact order she'd need to reverse it, her hands moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who'd done delicate, dangerous work under conditions where a mistake meant far more than a cracked antique. 40 years ago, before the gunsmithing, before the anonymity she'd built so carefully around herself, Marisol Adair had spent a career most people would never believe if she told them. Not behind a rifle, but behind documents. A forensic document examiner attached to a war crimes investigative unit, the kind of quiet, specialized work that never made headlines because its entire purpose was uncovering things certain powerful people needed to stay buried. She'd spent 2 decades authenticating and dismantling forged records, tracing falsified paper trails back to the men who'd created them, testifying in tribunals whose names never appeared in a newspaper because the men on trial had families with the resources to make sure they didn't. She'd retired quietly, moved twice, changed her professional life entirely, and told herself the past stayed exactly where she'd left it. Her hands found the true source of the corrosion behind the locking lugs exactly where she expected it. Years of moisture trapped in a poorly sealed joint. And she began the careful work of freeing it, cleaning each surface, testing tolerances with the patient attention of someone who'd learned, decades ago, that rushing precision work only made problems worse. It was while removing the buttstock entirely, to access a stripped screw threading deeper into the wood than the original manufacturer's specifications called for, that her fingers found something that didn't belong there. A narrow cavity, hollowed carefully into the wood beneath the stock steel butt plate, professionally concealed in a way that told her immediately this hadn't happened by accident during manufacture. Someone had modified this rifle, deliberately, sometime after it left the factory, and inside the cavity, wrapped in a thin layer of oiled cloth to protect it from moisture, sat a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, the creases soft and worn from having been folded and unfolded many times before it was hidden away for good. Marisol set down her tools. She unfolded the paper with the careful, practiced hands of someone who'd handled fragile documents for most of her professional life, and read words that had clearly been written in a hurry, decades ago, by someone who understood they might not get another chance to write them. It was a confession, handwritten, and signed except for a set of initials, EA, describing, in the plain, unflinching language of a man documenting his own guilt, an incident that had occurred during a military campaign 40-some years earlier, the deliberate falsification of casualty records to conceal a friendly fire incident that had killed 3 soldiers under his command, and the framing of a junior officer, a man the confession named only as Private Delgado, who had been court-martialed and dishonorably discharged for a failure that was never his. I have carried this, the confession read, in handwriting that had grown visibly shakier by its final lines, longer than I can carry it any further. If anyone finds this, it means I never found the courage to say it myself while I still had the chance. Delgado deserved better than what I let happen to him. Find his family. Tell them the truth, I was too much of a coward to tell while I was alive. Marisol read it twice. Then she looked at the rifle, the Winchester Model 1873, a family heirloom, for generations, currently sitting in her workshop belonging to a man named Reginald Ashcombe. She thought about the initials EA. She thought about what 4 generations might actually mean. She finished the repair with the same careful precision she'd have used regardless, because the rifle deserved competent work whatever secrets its stock had been hiding, and she carried it back out to the front room exactly 40 minutes after she'd disappeared through the door, the confession folded now inside her own shirt pocket rather than the rifle's cavity. Action's free, she said, setting the rifle on the counter and working the bolts smoothly to demonstrate. Cleaned, re-oiled, tolerances restored to spec. It'll cycle properly for another 100 years if it's maintained. Ashcombe stared at the smoothly cycling action with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last 40 minutes from skepticism to genuine, slightly embarrassed admiration. I don't know what to say. 3 smiths and weeks of waiting, and you did it in 40 minutes. You're welcome, Marisol said. Then, carefully, watching his face, Mr. Ashcombe, you said this rifle's been in your family 4 generations. Who was the original owner? My great-grandfather, Ellis Ashcombe. He served Ashcombe stopped, something flickering across his face at the memory of a story he'd clearly told many times before. He served with some distinction, actually. There's a whole family legend about it. Why do you ask? Marisol looked at him for a long moment, weighing exactly how much of what she'd found to say in a shop with a young apprentice standing 3 feet away, in a conversation that had started with an insult and might, depending on what came next, in somewhere far more complicated than either of them expected. While I had the stock disassembled, she said carefully, I found something hidden inside it, something that's been there a very long time. Ashcombe's easy, relieved expression faded into something more uncertain. What kind of something? I think, Marisol said, you and I should have a conversation somewhere more private than a gun shop counter. They spoke for an hour in the shop's small back office after Colton had locked the front door for the evening. Marisol laying out the confession, watching Ashcombe's face move through disbelief, then denial, then, slowly, a kind of horrified recognition as pieces of a family legend he'd been told his entire life realigned themselves into something considerably darker. My great-grandfather was a hero, Ashcombe said, though the conviction in his voice had thinned considerably by the 3rd read-through of the confession. There's a plaque. My family funded a memorial scholarship in his name, for God's sake. I'm not asking you to believe me, Marisol said. I'm asking you to consider that your great-grandfather hid a confession inside his own rifle instead of simply destroying it, which tells me something about a man carrying guilt he never resolved. Men who feel nothing don't hide confessions. They burn them. Ashcombe was quiet for a long moment, turning the folded paper over in his hands. Private Delgado, he said finally, if this is real, if my family's entire legacy is built on a lie that got an innocent man dishonorably discharged, what happens now? That depends on whether Delgado's family is still alive to hear it, Marisol said, and on whether you're willing to help me find out. It took 2 days of careful research, archived court-martial records, a genealogy database, 3 phone calls to a National Archives contact Marisol hadn't spoken to in over a decade, but who remembered her instantly and without question before they found him. Private Elias Delgado had died 11 years earlier, but his daughter, Rosa Delgado Nunez, was alive, 62 years old, living 2 states away, and had spent her entire childhood, she told Marisol over a shaking phone call, watching her father carry a shame that was never his to carry. He never talked about it, Rosa said, her voice tight with decades of accumulated grief. Not once, not to any of us. He came home from that court-martial a different man, and he stayed that way for the rest of his life. He died still believing he'd failed those 3 soldiers. He died still believing the whole world knew him as the coward who got them killed. He wasn't, Marisol said. I have a confession, in the original commanding officer's own handwriting, stating clearly that your father was innocent, that the casualties were the result of a friendly fire incident the officer covered up and pinned on your father instead. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Marisol thought the call had dropped. I need to see it, Rosa said finally, her voice breaking. I need to see it with my own eyes. The trouble started the following morning, when Marisol's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, area code local to Ashcombe's side of the state. Ms. Adair, a man's voice said, smooth and careful in the particular way of someone who'd rehearsed the call before making it. My name is Foster Ashcombe. I believe you spoke with my nephew Reginald about a document you found in an old family rifle. Marisol set down the part she'd been cleaning. I did. I'm going to be direct with you, Foster said. I'm an attorney, and I also happen to be the executor of the Ashcombe Family Trust, which includes a rather significant scholarship fund established in my grandfather's name, a fund that supports, among other things, a wing of the Regional Veterans Hospital. That fund exists because of the reputation my grandfather built over a long and, by all public accounts, distinguished career. I'd like to understand exactly what you think you found and exactly what you intend to do with it. Before my nephew does something impulsive that damages a legacy an entire community has come to rely on. I found a signed confession, Marisol said. Your grandfather framed an innocent man for an incident he covered up himself. I intend to see that the truth reaches the family it was stolen from. That document, Foster said, his careful tone hardening by a degree, has no verified chain of custody. It could be a forgery. It could be a fabrication planted by someone with a grudge against my family, possibly even planted recently, in a rifle that's changed hands multiple times over 4 generations. I don't think you understand what you're threatening to unravel, Ms. Adair, and I don't think you understand how difficult I am prepared to make this for you if you continue. I spent 20 years authenticating documents exactly like this one for a living, Mr. Ashcombe, Marisol said, something cold and precise settling into her voice. I know a forgery within the first 60 seconds of handling it. This wasn't one, and threats generally work better on people who haven't already spent a career being threatened by men with considerably more resources than you have. There was a long silence on the line. I'll be in touch, Foster said finally, and hung up. Reginald called an hour later, his voice tight, with an anger Marisol hadn't heard from him before. My uncle just threatened to have the legal aid attorney's license reviewed by the state bar, he said. He's threatening the scholarship funds board with a lawsuit if they proceed with any public acknowledgement. He's already had someone call Rosa directly and ask her to consider a private settlement in exchange for keeping this quiet. He called me too, Marisol said. I'm sorry. I didn't think he'd move this fast. I didn't think he'd move at all, honestly. I thought once he saw the document he'd understand there wasn't a version of this where hiding it made things better. Some people spend their whole lives believing reputation matters more than the truth it's built on, Marisol said. Your uncle sounds like one of them. What matters now is whether Rosa still has a path to a formal correction, regardless of what your family tries to do to slow it down. He's threatening to contest the authenticity of the document in a way that could tie this up in legal challenges for years, Reginald said. Rosa's 62. She's already waited her entire life for this. I don't think she has years left in her to wait for lawyers to finish fighting. Marisol was quiet for a moment, running through 2 decades of instinct she hadn't needed to use in a very long time. I still have contacts from my old career, she said finally. People who used to authenticate documents like this for tribunals that didn't care how much money or how many lawyers stood on the other side of the table. If your uncle wants to contest the authenticity in court, I can make sure it survives a challenge from far better attorneys than his. You do that. I already started something the day I opened that rifle stock, Marisol said. I don't intend to let a man protecting his grandfather's plaque be the reason it doesn't finish. It took 2 more weeks. A formal forensic authentication conducted jointly with a document examiner Marisol had trained personally 15 years earlier, an independent handwriting analysis matching the confession against verified wartime correspondence pulled from military archives, and a quiet but firm letter from the Veterans Legal Aid Office informing Foster Ashcombe that any attempt to obstruct a formal military record correction would itself become part of the public case file before Foster's resistance finally, visibly, collapsed. Reginald Ashcombe met Rosa Delgado Nunez in person 8 days later, in a small conference room at a Veterans Legal Aid office that specialized in posthumous military record corrections, a meeting Ashcombe had insisted on funding personally, arriving not with lawyers to protect his family's reputation, but with the confession itself, framed under glass, and a check to cover whatever costs stood between Rosa and the formal correction of her father's discharge record. Marisol sat quietly at the edge of the room, watching a process unfold that she'd spent an entire hidden career making possible for people who'd never known her name, and would go right on not knowing it after this, too. I owe your family an apology I can't possibly make large enough, Ashcombe told Rosa, his voice unsteady. My great-grandfather let an innocent man carry his guilt for the rest of his life. I don't know how to fix 70 years of that. I only know I'm not going to let it stay buried in a rifle stock for another 70. Rosa held the framed confession with both hands, reading her father's vindication in a dead man's own guilty handwriting, and wept in a way that looked, Marisol thought, less like grief and more like something finally, after decades, being allowed to set itself down. He deserved to know this while he was alive, Rosa said quietly. But at least now everyone else will. The legal aid attorney handling the case looked between them, then at Marisol, still sitting quietly at the edge of the room. I have to ask, the attorney said. How exactly did all of this come to light? The case file just says an anonymous tip led to the discovery. There was a rifle that needed fixing, Marisol said simply. Sometimes that's all it takes. 3 weeks later, the bell over the front door of Hargrove and Sons chimed at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and Colton looked up from the counter to see Reginald Ashcombe walk in. No rifle this time. Just a small wrapped package under his arm. I'm not here for a repair, Ashcombe told him. I'm here to see Marisol, if she's available. Colton, who'd learned considerably more about the woman in the back room over the past 3 weeks than he ever had in the previous 4 years, knocked once and opened the door without waiting for permission. Marisol looked up from her bench, reading glasses pushed into silver hair, and found Ashcombe standing in the doorway with an expression considerably more humble than the one he'd worn the last time he stood in this shop. Rosa's father's discharge was formally corrected last week, Ashcombe said. Honorable, posthumous, full record restored. She asked me to bring you this. He set the small package on Marisol's workbench and stepped back, letting her unwrap it herself. Inside sat a single brass rifle cartridge, polished to a shine, engraved along its casing with 3 words, thank you. Ardian. She said you'd understand what it meant better than any thank you card could say it, Ashcombe said. Marisol turned the cartridge over in her fingers, feeling the careful engraving beneath her thumb, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, something that felt close to peace with a career she'd spent decades keeping entirely to herself. Tell her, Marisol said, that it's more than enough. Ashcombe nodded, lingered a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, and turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. For what it's worth, he said, I'm sorry for what I said, that first day, about you being some grandmother who couldn't be trusted with a real mechanism. You're not the first person to underestimate the woman in the back room, Marisol said, setting the cartridge carefully on her bench beside her tools, and I doubt you'll be the last. It's rarely as inconvenient for me as people assume it'll be. Ashcombe almost smiled at that, then left the way he'd come, the bell chiming once behind him. Marisol sat alone for a moment in the quiet of her workshop, the cartridge catching the afternoon light on the bench in front of her, before she reached for the next rifle waiting in line, and got back to the quiet, careful work of fixing what other people had given up on.